Venezuela accelerates the multipolar world. Let me take you back to July 29, 2024, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another diplomatic spat in a world already overflowing with them. That was the day Venezuela's Supreme Tribunal of Justice upheld a ruling annexing two-thirds of neighboring Guyana's territory, a move that sent shockwaves through the Caribbean and beyond. The mainstream narrative framed this as another chapter in Venezuela's long descent into authoritarianism, a rogue state flexing its muscles over a disputed border that dates back to colonial times. But here's what they're not telling: this isn't just about Guyana. This is about the death of American hegemony, the rise of a new world order, and the quiet, methodical dismantling of the unipolar system that has defined global politics since the fall of the Soviet Union. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the intersection of resource politics, great power competition, and the slow-motion collapse of U.S. dominance. What's happening in Venezuela right now isn't an isolated crisis, it's a geopolitical earthquake, one that reveals the fractures in Washington's global strategy and the accelerating shift toward a multipolar world. And if you think this is just about oil or a border dispute, you're missing the bigger picture. Let's start with the official story, the one you've probably heard. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, has been a pariah state for years, its economy in tatters, its people fleeing by the millions. The dispute over the Essequibo region, a 160,000 square kilometer swath of jungle and coastline rich in oil and minerals, has simmered for over a century. Guyana, the smaller and weaker neighbor, has long claimed the territory under international law, while Venezuela has insisted it was stolen during colonial map drawing. In 2018, ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Essequibo, turning a historical footnote into a potential bonanza. Fast forward to 2023, and Maduro's government suddenly ramped up its rhetoric, holding a referendum where Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted to reclaim the region. By early 2024, Venezuela was conducting military exercises near the border, and Guyana, feeling the pressure, turned to its traditional the United States. The U.S. response was swift and predictable. The Biden administration condemned Venezuela's actions as provocative and destabilizing, reaffirmed its support for Guyana's territorial integrity, and even sent a high-level delegation to Georgetown to discuss military cooperation. The State Department framed this as a clear-cut case of a bully picking on a smaller neighbor, with the U.S. standing as the defender of international law. The media followed suit, portraying Maduro as a desperate dictator clinging to power by manufacturing a crisis. The numbers seem to back this. Venezuela's GDP has shrunk by over 75% since 2013, its oil production is a fraction of what it was in the 1990s, and its military, while well-armed, is stretched thin by internal security concerns. But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes that Venezuela is acting alone, that this is purely a domestic political maneuver by Maduro to distract from his failures. It ignores the broader geopolitical currents pulling Venezuela into a new axis of power, one that sees the U.S. not as an indispensable leader, but as a declining hegemon in desperate need of containment. Here's what's really happening. Venezuela's move on Essequibo isn't just about oil, though that's certainly part of it. It's about signaling to the world that the rules of the game have changed. For decades, the U.S. has treated Latin America as its backyard, intervening at will to install or remove governments, control resources, and enforce economic orthodoxy. But in the last 10 years, 2 things have shifted. First, China and Russia have deepened their engagement in the region, offering an alternative to Washington's dominance. Second, the U.S. itself has become a less reliable partner, its attention divided by wars in the Middle East, competition with China in Asia, and domestic political dysfunction. Venezuela has been at the center of this shift. Since 2019, when the U.S. recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president in a failed regime change operation, Maduro's government has pivoted hard toward Moscow and Beijing. Russia has provided military support, including advanced S-300 air defense systems, while China has kept Venezuela afloat with loans, oil for credit deals, and infrastructure investments. In return, Venezuela has become a key node in the emerging multipolar order, a country willing to challenge U.S. dominance in its own hemisphere. Now, let's talk about Essequibo. The official U.S. position is that Venezuela's claims are baseless, that Guyana's sovereignty is inviolable, and that any military action would be met with a swift response. But here's where the story gets interesting. The US has a long history of ignoring international law when it suits its interests, see Iraq, Libya, or its own support for Israel's occupation of Palestinian territories. So why the sudden moral outrage over Essequibo? The answer lies in the oil. ExxonMobil, which has been drilling in Guyana's waters since 2015, has turned the country into the world's fastest-growing oil producer. Guyana's output is expected to reach 1.2 million barrels per day by 2027, making it a critical supplier for the US and its allies as they try to wean themselves off Russian and Middle Eastern oil. Venezuela's move on Essequibo isn't just a threat to Guyana, it's a direct challenge to US energy security. And Maduro knows it. He's betting that the US is too distracted by Ukraine, Taiwan, and its own internal divisions to mount a serious response. He's also betting that China and Russia will have his back. And so far, that bet is paying off. Let me tell you something that few in Washington want: to the US is losing Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, which declared the Western Hemisphere off-limits to foreign powers, is dead. China is now the top trading partner for most of South America, and Russia has re-established itself as a major military and political player in the region. Venezuela is just the most visible example of this shift. In the last 2 years alone, we've seen Honduras switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China, Nicaragua deepen its ties with Russia, and Brazil's Lula da Silva openly flirt with the idea of a BRICS currency to replace the dollar in trade. The US response? More sanctions, more military exercises, and more empty rhetoric about democracy promotion. It's not working. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Venezuela's actions aren't just about defying the US. They're about forcing a reckoning with the new multipolar reality. Maduro isn't acting in a vacuum, he's coordinating with Moscow and Beijing. In the weeks leading up to Venezuela's Supreme Court ruling, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov visited Caracas, and Chinese officials held high-level talks with Venezuelan counterparts. The message was: if Venezuela moves on Essequibo, Russia and China will provide diplomatic cover and economic support. This is how the multipolar world is being built, not through grand declarations, but through a series of calculated moves that chip away at US dominance. Venezuela's gambit is a test case. If it succeeds, other countries in the region will follow. If it fails, the US will have bought itself some time, but at what cost? Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing in Venezuela is part of a much larger struggle between the old unipolar order and the emerging multipolar one. The US has spent the last 30 years trying to maintain its global hegemony, but its strategy, military intervention, economic coercion, and ideological crusades has backfired spectacularly. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, these weren't just failures, they were symptoms of a deeper malaise. The US can no longer impose its will on the world through force alone. Meanwhile, China and Russia have spent the last 2 decades building alternative institutions: the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, that offer countries a way out of the US-dominated system. Venezuela is a microcosm of this struggle. The US sees it as a rogue state that must be contained. China and Russia see it as a partner in the new multipolar order. And Maduro? He's playing both sides, leveraging US hostility to justify his rule while deepening ties with America's rivals. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. The US has responded to Venezuela's moves by increasing its military presence in the region. In April 2024, the U.S. Southern Command conducted joint exercises with Guyana's military, and the Pentagon has reportedly drawn up contingency plans for a rapid deployment to the region if Venezuela invades. But here's the U.S. military is stretched thin. It's already committed to supporting Ukraine against Russia, deterring China in the Taiwan Strait, and maintaining a presence in the Middle East. Adding another front in South America would be a logistical nightmare. And let's not forget the lessons of history. The U.S. has a long and disastrous record of military intervention in Latin America, from the Bay of Pigs to the Contra War in Nicaragua to the failed coup in Venezuela in 2002. Every time the U.S. has tried to remove a government in the region, it has ended in failure or blowback. Venezuela is no exception. Maduro may be unpopular, but he's not Saddam Hussein. He has a core of loyal supporters, a well-armed military, and the backing of Russia and China. Any US military action would be messy, costly, and likely counterproductive. But the hawks in Washington don't see it that way. They see Venezuela as a low-hanging fruit, a country that can be easily toppled with a little push. They're wrong. Venezuela is a powder keg, and the US is playing with fire. Let's turn to the domestic political dimension. The Biden administration's response to Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics, it's also about politics at home. Florida, a critical swing state, has a large Venezuelan exile community that is deeply hostile to Maduro. The administration has been under pressure from both Republicans and some Democrats to take a harder line on Venezuela. In 2023, the U.S. eased some sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for promises of free elections, but when Maduro reneged on those promises, the administration reimposed them. Now, with the Essequibo crisis heating up, the administration is caught between a rock and a hard place. It can't afford to look weak on Venezuela, but it also can't afford another foreign policy quagmire. This is the paradox of U.S. foreign policy today. The American public is war-weary, and the political establishment is divided. But the foreign policy blob, the think tanks, the defense contractors, the career diplomats still operates on the assumption that the U.S. must maintain its global dominance at all costs. The result is a strategy that is neither coherent nor sustainable. So where does this leave us? Let's consider the scenarios. Scenario: the best case. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies manage to deter Venezuela through a combination of diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, and military posturing. Guyana retains control of Essequibo, and Venezuela backs down without a shot being fired. The U.S. declares victory, and the status quo is preserved for now. But this scenario is unlikely. Maduro has too much to gain from escalating the crisis, and the U.S. lacks the leverage to force a retreat. Scenario: the most likely. Here, Venezuela makes a limited incursion into Essequibo, seizing a small but symbolically important piece of territory. The U.S. responds with sanctions and military exercises, but stops short of direct intervention. China and Russia provide Venezuela with economic and diplomatic support, and the crisis becomes a frozen conflict like Crimea or Western Sahara. The U.S. is forced to accept anew it no longer has the power to dictate outcomes in its own hemisphere. Scenario: the worst case. In this scenario, Venezuela launches a full-scale invasion of Essequibo, triggering a U.S. military response. The U.S. deploys troops to Guyana, and Venezuela retaliates by targeting U.S. assets in the region. Russia and China condemn the U.S. but stop short of direct military involvement. The conflict spirals into a regional war, with unpredictable consequences. This is the nightmare scenario, and while it's not the most likely, it's not impossible. None of these scenarios are good. The best case is a temporary reprieve. The most likely is a slow-motion defeat for U.S. hegemony. The worst case is a catastrophe. So what should the U.S. do? Here's where I'm going to say something: the U.S. needs to accept that it can no longer dictate the terms of global politics. The era of unipolarity is over. The question is not whether the world will become multipolar, it's how the U.S. will adapt to that reality. Instead of doubling down on military intervention and economic coercion, the U.S. should pursue a strategy of great power management. That means engaging with Venezuela, not as a rogue state to be punished, but as a sovereign country with legitimate interests. It means working with China and Russia to de-escalate tensions, rather than treating them as irreconcilable enemies. And it means recognizing that the U.S. can no longer afford to be the world's policeman. This isn't about appeasement. It's about realism. The U.S. still has immense power, but it's no longer the only game in town. The sooner Washington accepts that, the better its chances of navigating the new multipolar world. Let me leave you with this thought. The crisis in Venezuela isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of global order. The U.S. has spent the last 30 years trying to maintain a unipolar system that was always unsustainable. Now, the chickens are coming home to roost. The question is whether the U.S. will adapt or double down on a strategy that has already failed. The choice is ours. But time is running out. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela's territorial ambitions or Guyana's oil reserves, it's about the military architecture of the Western Hemisphere itself. For decades, the US has treated Latin America as its strategic backyard, a zone of uncontested dominance where Washington could project power without meaningful resistance. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a geopolitical assumption, one that shaped everything from the Bay of Pigs to Plan Colombia. But that assumption is now being tested in ways we haven't seen since the Cold War, and this time, the challengers aren't just ideological, they're structural. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's military posture isn't operating in a vacuum. Since 2019, Russia has deepened its military cooperation with Caracas, supplying advanced S-300 air defense systems, Sukhoi Su-30 fighter jets, and even deploying long-range bombers for joint exercises. In 2022, the Russian Navy conducted its largest-ever naval drills in the Caribbean, just miles from U.S. shores. Meanwhile, China has been quietly embedding itself in Venezuela's military-industrial complex, providing satellite technology, drones, and cyber capabilities that could disrupt U.S. command and control systems in a crisis. The uncomfortable truth here is that Venezuela isn't just a client state, it's becoming a forward operating base for great power competition in the Americas. Here's where things get even more complicated. The U.S. has spent the last 2 decades fighting counterinsurgency wars in the Middle East, but the Pentagon's playbook for a near-peer conflict in its own hemisphere is dangerously outdated. The Southern Command, or SOUTHCOM, is one of the most under-resourced combatant commands in the U.S. military. Its budget is a fraction of what's allocated to Indo-Pacific Command or European Command, and its force posture is designed for counter-narcotics operations, not high-intensity warfare. If Venezuela were to launch a hybrid attack, combining cyber disruptions, drone swarms, and proxy forces, SOUTHCOM would be hard-pressed to respond effectively without escalating to direct kinetic strikes. And that's the real risk. The U.S. has grown accustomed to fighting asymmetric wars where it holds overwhelming technological and logistical superiority. But in a conflict with Venezuela, even a limited one, the calculus changes. Russia and China wouldn't need to intervene directly to make this a nightmare for Washington. They could provide real-time intelligence, electronic warfare support, or even just diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council. The moment U.S. forces cross into Guyana, Venezuela could invoke the Rio Treaty, forcing Latin American nations to take sides. Brazil, which shares a 2,200-kilometer border with Venezuela, has already signaled it won't tolerate a U.S. military buildup in the region. Argentina, under Javier Milei, might be more sympathetic to Washington, but Buenos Aires is in no position to offer meaningful military support. The result? A fractured hemisphere, with the U.S. isolated and its regional alliances in tatters. Now, let's talk about the nuclear dimension, because yes, it matters here too. Venezuela doesn't have nukes, but Russia does. And in 2023, Putin explicitly warned that any attack on Russian assets in Venezuela would be considered an attack on Russia itself. That's not just rhetoric. In 2019, when the U.S. imposed sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, Russia responded by sending nuclear-capable bombers to Caracas. The message was Venezuela is under Moscow's security umbrella. If the U.S. were to strike Venezuelan military targets, say, an S-300 battery or a Russian-made radar system, it would be crossing a red line that could trigger a much broader confrontation. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. has no good military options in Venezuela. A full-scale invasion is politically and logistically unthinkable. A limited strike risks escalation with Russia. And a proxy war through Guyana would only deepen the crisis. The Pentagon knows this, which is why the Biden administration has been so cautious, despite the hawkish rhetoric from some quarters. But caution alone isn't a strategy. The longer the U.S. clings to the idea that it can dictate outcomes in Latin America, the more it risks sleepwalking into a conflict it can't win. So what's the alternative? First, the U.S. needs to recognize that military power alone won't solve this. The era of gunboat diplomacy is over. Second, it needs to engage with Venezuela not as a pariah, but as a country with legitimate security concerns. That doesn't mean endorsing Maduro's regime, but it does mean acknowledging that the U.S. can't simply wish away Venezuela's alliances with Russia and China. Third, the US should work with regional partners to establish clear red lines. Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico have far more influence in Caracas than Washington does. If the US wants to prevent a war, it needs to let Latin America take the lead in mediating the crisis. Finally, the US must accept that its military posture in the hemisphere needs a fundamental rethink. Southcom's budget needs to be increased, not just for counter-narcotics, but for conventional deterrence. The US should also explore confidence-building measures with Russia and China in Latin America, such as joint military exercises or deconfliction hotlines. The goal isn't to legitimize their presence, but to manage the risks of miscalculation. Let me be none of this is about conceding to authoritarianism or abandoning democratic values. It's about recognizing that the world has changed, and the tools that worked in the 20th century no longer apply. The US still has immense leverage economic, diplomatic, and military, but it can no longer wield that power unilaterally. The multipolar world isn't coming. It's already here. The question is whether the US will adapt or cling to a strategy that's doomed to fail. The crisis in Venezuela is a microcosm of a larger shift. The US is no longer the sole superpower, and the sooner it accepts that, the better its chances of shaping the new order rather than being shaped by it. The alternative, a regional war that drags in great powers, is a scenario none of us can afford. The time to act is now, before the next escalation makes diplomacy impossible. Because in a multipolar world, the cost of failure isn't just defeat, it's irrelevance. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's domestic political landscape is far more fluid and far more dangerous than the binary narratives of Maduro the dictator versus Guaidó the Democrat would suggest. The reality is that the country has become a pressure cooker of competing factions, each with their own foreign backers, and each capable of igniting a regional conflagration if the lid blows off. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. First, we need to dispense with the idea that Maduro is a monolithic strongman in full control. Yes, he's survived sanctions, coup attempts, and mass protests, but his grip on power is far more fragile than it appears. The Venezuelan military, long the backbone of the regime, is not a unified institution. It's a patchwork of factions, some loyal to Maduro, others to Diosdado Cabello, the powerful National Assembly president and former military officer with deep ties to the Cuban intelligence apparatus. Then there are the colectivos, the armed civilian groups that act as the regime's enforcers, and the PRANs, the prison gang leaders who control entire neighborhoods. These aren't just thugs, they're power brokers with their own agendas, and they answer to different patrons within the state. The uncomfortable truth is that Venezuela today resembles a feudal system more than a modern dictatorship. Maduro isn't a king, he's a first among equals, constantly negotiating with these factions to stay in power. This fragmentation is why the regime's survival strategy has been so erratic. One day, Maduro is courting the US with oil for sanctions relief talks, the next, he's hosting Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders and signing military cooperation deals with Russia. This isn't just ideological posturing. It's a survival tactic. The regime knows that if it loses its foreign backers, Russia for military support, China for economic lifelines, Iran for sanctions-busting expertise, it collapses. But here's those same backers are also playing their own games. Moscow doesn't want Venezuela to become a failed state, it wants a dependent client. Beijing doesn't want a war on its doorstep, it wants a stable source of oil and a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And Iran? It's using Venezuela as a proxy to bleed the US, not to build a socialist utopia. The result is a regime that's simultaneously emboldened and constrained by its patrons, a tightrope walk that could snap at any moment. Now, let's talk about the opposition. The narrative that Juan Guaidó was the great democratic hope was always a fantasy, but it's particularly absurd now. Guaidó's interim government, recognized by the US and its allies, has collapsed into irrelevance. The opposition is deeply divided, with factions ranging from hardline anti-Chavistas to those willing to negotiate with Maduro. The problem isn't just infighting, it's that the opposition has no credible plan for governing. The 2019 maximum pressure strategy failed because it assumed that economic collapse would force the military to abandon Maduro. Instead, the military doubled down, and the opposition's legitimacy evaporated. Today, the most viable opposition figures, like Enrique Capriles or Leopoldo Lopez, are either in exile or sidelined. The ones left are either too radical or too compromised to be taken seriously. This brings us to the most dangerous: a power vacuum. If Maduro were to suddenly fall, whether through a coup, an assassination, or a popular uprising, there is no coherent alternative ready to take over. The military would fracture, the colectivos would go rogue, and the country could descend into a multi-sided civil war. We've seen this movie: Libya in 2011, Syria in 2012, Yemen in 2015. The difference is that Venezuela is sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, shares a border with Colombia, and has already become a hub for Russian and Iranian influence. A collapse in Caracas wouldn't just be a humanitarian disaster, it would be a geopolitical earthquake. So what are the possible outcomes? Let's lay them out. The first scenario is managed decline, the status quo, but with more international engagement. Maduro remains in power, but the regime agrees to limited reforms in exchange for sanctions relief. This is the path the Biden administration has been quietly pursuing, with mixed results. The problem is that Maduro has no incentive to make real concessions. Why would he? The US has already shown it's desperate to lower oil prices, and Venezuela is one of the few countries that can increase production quickly. The regime knows this, which is why it keeps dragging out negotiations. The recent talks in Mexico City were a farce, with Maduro demanding the US lift all sanctions before any elections are held. That's not diplomacy, it's extortion. But here's the US might have to pay the ransom. If oil prices spike again, say, because of a new Middle East crisis, Washington will have no choice but to cut a deal. The question is whether Maduro will actually deliver, or if he'll pocket the concessions and keep tightening his grip. The second scenario is regime collapse, either through a coup or a popular uprising. This is the outcome the US has been hoping for since 2019, but it's also the most dangerous. A coup would likely come from within the military, but it's unclear who would lead it. Diosdado Cabello? A disgruntled general? Either way, the result would be chaos. The military is not a monolith, and any attempt to seize power would trigger a violent backlash from the collectivos and loyalist factions. A popular uprising, on the other hand, would require a level of organization and leadership that the opposition currently lacks. The 2017 protests were brutally crushed, and the opposition has never recovered. Even if Maduro were to fall, the country would be ungovernable. We'd see a repeat of the 1990s, when Venezuela's last democratic collapse led to the rise of Chavez. The difference now is that the country is armed to the teeth, and the great powers are already involved. The third scenario is foreign intervention, either by the US or a coalition of Latin American states. This is the nightmare scenario, but it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. If Venezuela's crisis spills over into Colombia, say, through a mass refugee exodus or a cross-border conflict with FARC dissidents, the US might be forced to act. The problem is that any intervention would be a logistical and political disaster. The US military is not equipped for a prolonged occupation, and the American public has zero appetite for another war. A Latin American coalition, led by Brazil or Colombia, would face similar challenges. The last time the region tried to intervene in a crisis like this was the 1965 Dominican Republic intervention, and that was a mess. Today, with Russia and China involved, the stakes are even higher. Any intervention would risk a direct confrontation with Moscow or Beijing, and that's a line no one wants to cross. The fourth scenario, and the one that keeps me up at night, is controlled escalation. This is where the regime, facing internal pressure, deliberately provokes a crisis to rally nationalist support. We've seen this playbook: the 2008 Georgian War, the 2014 annexation of Crimea, the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. In Venezuela's case, the trigger could be a border skirmish with Guyana over the Essequibo dispute, or a false flag attack on a Russian or Iranian asset in the country. The goal wouldn't be to win a war, but to create a sense of siege that justifies further repression. The risk is that this spirals out of control. If Venezuela attacks Guyana, Brazil might intervene to protect its northern border. If Russia or Iran are targeted, they might retaliate against US interests in the region. And if the US responds militarily, we're back to the intervention scenario. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome, in my view, is a prolonged stalemate, neither collapse nor reform, but a slow-motion decay that keeps the regime in power while the country sinks further into poverty and criminality. This is the worst of all worlds, because it guarantees that Venezuela remains a geopolitical flashpoint for years to come. The US will keep trying to contain the crisis, Russia and China will keep exploiting it, and the Venezuelan people will keep suffering. But here's the uncomfortable: none of these scenarios are inevitable. The key variable is the US response. If Washington continues to treat Venezuela as a problem to be solved through sanctions and rhetoric, the crisis will fester. If it engages with the reality of a multipolar world, accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere, but that the US still has leverage, it might be able to shape the outcome. That means working with regional partners to create off-ramps for the regime, offering sanctions relief in exchange for real reforms, and preparing for the day when Maduro is no longer in power. The alternative is a regional war that drags in the great powers. And in a world where the US is no longer the sole superpower, that's a risk we can't afford to take. The time to act is now, before the next crisis makes diplomacy impossible. Because in Venezuela, as in so many other places, the multipolar world isn't coming, it's already here. The question is whether we'll be smart enough to navigate it. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader contest over the rules of the 21st century. The establishment narrative in Washington still clings to the idea that the US can dictate outcomes through pressure alone, as if we're still living in the unipolar moment of the 1990s. But that world is gone, and Venezuela is one of the clearest examples of why. The regime in Caracas has survived not because it's strong, but because the alternatives presented by the US and its allies have been either unrealistic or counterproductive. Sanctions didn't topple Maduro, they just pushed him into the arms of Russia and China. Diplomatic isolation didn't force concessions, it gave him a convenient enemy to rally against. And the occasional half-hearted talk of regime change only reinforced the siege mentality that keeps the military loyal. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. The way the US handles Caracas will set a precedent for how it engages with other revisionist states, whether it's Iran in the Middle East, North Korea in East Asia, or even a future leftist government in Mexico. If the approach remains one of maximalist pressure with no off-ramps, we'll see more of the regimes digging in, great power competition intensifying, and crises festering until they explode. The alternative isn't appeasement, it's recognizing that in a multipolar world, leverage is a two-way street. The US still has cards to play, but it has to be willing to negotiate in good faith, not just issue ultimatums. Here's the uncomfortable: the Biden administration's Venezuela policy is a microcosm of its broader foreign policy struggles. On one hand, there's a recognition that the old playbook isn't working, hence the occasional outreach to Maduro, like the brief sanctions relief in 2022 in exchange for oil exports or the prisoner swaps that followed. On the other hand, there's an unwillingness to fully commit to a new approach, as if the administration is afraid of being accused of going soft by domestic critics. The result is a policy that oscillates between engagement and confrontation, with no clear strategy. In October 2023, for example, the US reimposed sanctions on Venezuela's gold sector after Maduro's government backtracked on election promises. That move was predictable, but it also showed the limits of a strategy that relies on punishment without offering a path forward. The grand strategy question, then, is whether the US can adapt to a world where it no longer calls all the shots. In Venezuela, that means accepting three hard realities. First, Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term, and any policy that assumes otherwise is doomed to fail. Second, the regime's survival depends on its ability to play great powers off each other, so the US needs to work with allies to deny it that leverage. And third, the only way to break the stalemate is to create incentives for gradual change, not just hope for collapse. What would that look like in practice? For starters, the US could offer a clear roadmap for sanctions relief tied to verifiable reforms, freeing political prisoners, allowing independent election observers, and reining in the military's role in the economy. It could work with Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico to create a regional framework for engagement, rather than letting Venezuela become a proxy battleground between Washington and Moscow. And it could prepare for a post-Maduro transition by engaging with opposition figures who aren't just exiles with no domestic support, but leaders with real constituencies inside the country. The 2024 election is a critical test here. If the US pushes for a free and fair process but also signals that it's willing to work with whoever wins, even if it's Maduro, it might actually encourage the regime to take the election seriously. If it doesn't, we'll likely see a repeat of 2018, when the opposition boycotted the vote and Maduro claimed a hollow victory. The alternatives are far worse. One is a return to the Trump-era strategy of maximum pressure, which only deepened Venezuela's economic crisis and pushed it closer to Russia and Iran. The other is a full-blown regional conflict, which could draw in Brazil, Colombia, and even NATO allies if the US gets involved militarily. Neither of those outcomes serves US interests, but they're exactly what we'll get if we keep pretending that the old rules still apply. I've spent enough time in Caracas and Washington to know that neither side trusts the other, and neither is blameless. But the fact remains that Venezuela is a failing state with a nuclear-armed patron and a deepening alliance with Iran. That's not a problem that can be ignored or wished away. The question is whether the US will treat it as a threat to be contained or an opportunity to shape the emerging multipolar order. The latter requires a level of strategic patience that Washington has rarely shown in recent decades, but it's the only path that avoids disaster. In the end, Venezuela's crisis is a test case for the 21st century. It's a place where the old unipolar order is colliding with the new multipolar reality, where great power competition is playing out in the streets of a country that shouldn't matter as much as it does. The tragedy is that the Venezuelan people are caught in the middle, but the irony is that their suffering is what makes the crisis so geopolitically significant. The world's major powers aren't fighting over Venezuela because it's strong, they're fighting over it because it's weak, because its collapse could redraw the map of the Americas, and because its alliances could shift the balance of power in ways we're only beginning to understand. That's why the time to act is now, before the next crisis, whether it's an invasion of Guyana, a Russian military base in Laorquila, or an Iranian-backed attack on US personnel, makes diplomacy impossible. The multipolar world isn't coming. It's here. And Venezuela is one of the places where we'll find out whether we're ready for it.